All right, so it's getting close to the time of Easter, and there's something that comes up almost every year, and it's about the word Easter found in the King James version. Now, I did a study on this the word Easter in Acts chapter 12 verse 4. I actually wrote a paper, I want to say a couple of years ago, on it, and my position on it essentially hasn't changed. I'll relink to the document here if you want to see it. The document is, well, I mean, it's not super polished in terms of like formatting and grammar and like the way I say things. So I wanted to do sort of like a video kind of talking through this issue. So, is there an error in the King James Version in Acts chapter 12, verse 4? If you can see on the screen here, let's read. This is the King James. It says, talking about Herod, when he had apprehended him would be Peter in the context, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. And what will happen is people will say a few things. Well, the first thing is that people will say that Easter in the King James Version here is a translation error. They'll say it's a translation error. If you look here on this word Easter, and while my computer is being very slow, probably because I'm recording this video. So Easter here is this word Pashka. Can't see in Greek. In Greek, it's Pashka. So let's scroll back down here. Pascha, which is normally as you'll see here, the Greek lexicons will say Passover. And this word in every other place, even in the King James, is translated as Passover. So basically the argument goes that Pascha here should be translated Easter. And so because should be translated as Passover. And so the King James has the word Easter here. And some people online have called this a goof in the King James Version. Albert Barnes, in his commentary, for example, in Acts 12, verse 2, says, quote, there was never a more absurd or unhappy translation than this. The original is simply after the Passover. The Christian Apologetics Research Ministry says Easter may be a rather benign translation error, but it's still an error. Some people will say the King James mistranslates Pascha as Easter rather than Passover. Okay, so rather than me comment on that, which I'll get to this eventually and I'll deal with this, the way that a lot of people who defend the King James Version a lot of times will react to this is they'll say that Easter in Acts chapter 12, verse 4 here is referring to a pagan holiday. So David Cloud, in his Way of Life encyclopedia, for example, says that Easter is, quote, a pagan holiday. This is the only place in which Easter appears in the authorized version and it refers to a pagan holiday, probably the celebration of Tammuz, the sun god. Okay, that's the Way of Life encyclopedia entry on Easter. There's a quote that I found on another website, for example. James Raspberry asserted that, quote, Easter was a pagan holiday that the pagan King Herod was going to observe. D.A. Wade, in his Defined King James Bible, has this definition for Easter in a footnote: Ishtar, an ancient pagan festival. It also says Easter was originally the name of a pagan spring festival that occurred about the same time as the Passover. In his tract, the King James Bible Dictionary, O. Ray Smith defined Easter as Ishtar, an ancient pagan festival. Now, people try to say that Easter is a pagan festival. And this argument essentially rests on a few parts. Number one, it's an etymological argument. Etymology basically has to do with like the sounds and the roots of words. So what people will say is they'll say Easter has an etymological root that comes from some kind of pagan god or goddess. And therefore, the word Easter is referring to a pagan holiday. There's a website, very popular website, it's called KJV and it says, quote, what means the term Easter itself? It's not a Christian name. It bears its Chaldean origin on its forehead. Easter is nothing else than Astarte. And you see there the similarity in sound between Easter and Astarte. And he says it's one of the titles of Beltis, the Queen of Heaven, blah, 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 blah. And he quotes from Alexander Hislop's book, The Two Babylons. He goes on, he says the Old English word for the month of April was Easter Manath. And anyway, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but basically what this is what is called an etymological fallacy. Now, I have a background in linguistics. I've taken studies in linguistics. I've studied Hebrew and Greek. I listen to a linguistic podcast regularly called Lexicon Valley. And that doesn't mean I'm infallible, and doesn't mean I'm right on everything that I say when it comes to language and identifying Bible words. But this is what's called a a etymological fallacy. The etymological fallacy is essentially, and you can go Google the etymological fallacy, or sometimes it's called the root fallacy. And the etymological fallacy is to assume that the origin of a word is its true meaning. Okay, so it's also defined as assigning the original meaning of word to its usage throughout history. So in layman terms, it's assuming that a word's meaning always comes from its root or its way back from history. So consider the word awful. The word awful comes from a root. If you look at the etymology, it's the word awe, which means to be in wonder or amazement. But today, if I said you're awful, I'm not necessarily saying that you're full of wonder or amazement. I could just be saying you're bad. So the etymological fallacy doesn't take into account that words change meaning over time. Okay? And there may be some reason and some loose connection why the word Easter, may be connected to maybe the word for that month sounded like the phonetic terms for Easter. Maybe Astarte does sound like Eostre, which sounds like Easter. But again, words change meaning over time. And so just because you can find a pagan goddess whose name might sound like the consonants and things for Easter, that doesn't necessarily mean that the word Easter is referring to a pagan holiday, because words ultimately are defined by how they're used, okay? So, and you can Google, do some more research on your own, look up the etymological fallacy, look up the root fallacy, things like that, okay? Now, the reason why people lean towards this idea of Easter being a pagan holiday is there's a contextual argument that people make, and the argument goes something like this. So if you were to look at Numbers chapter 28, and we won't go there, the Bible says in Numbers that the Passover day is on the 14th day of the month. It's the 14th day of Nisan, okay? And if you look in the passage in Acts, it says that in Acts chapter 12, verse 2, it says the days, it says, then were the days of unleavened bread, indicating that the days of unleavened bread started. So what they say is, therefore, in verse 4, Pascha or Easter can't be referring to the Passover, because they would say the Passover starts on the 14th day of Nisan, and the days of unleavened bread are after the 14 days of Nisan. I'll let some other people who take the position define it. The Way of Life Encyclopedia says, quote, some say that this should be translated Passover, and they point this as an error. They're wrong. Easter of Acts 12 verse 4 occurs after the Passover. We know this because Acts 12 verse 3 says it was, quote, the days of unleavened bread, and the feast of unleavened bread followed the Passover. There are other people like Jack Mormon said the same thing. He said in this one passage, Easter has to be used because Passover would have conflicted with the context. And there are a lot of other people. Peter Ruckman held this view. Other people. David Sorensen wrote, quote, Passover had already passed. It was the week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Sam Gepp, he followed this. In the Rock of Ages Study Bible, it says, quote, the Passover had passed, according to Leviticus 23, which was the day before the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Herod was celebrating the Feast of Ishtar. Now, this sounds really good. And it makes sense. The only problem is that it's a false premise, and the false premise is that the word Passover always and only refers to the specific 14th day of Nisan, okay? But even in the Bible, it seems like the word Passover is sometimes used to refer to that whole 8-day period, including the 14th Nisan and including the 7 days of unleavened bread. It'd be like I mean, we don't really do this in English, but it'd be like if we referred to the full 25 days leading up to Christmas, and it's like if we refer to that whole time period as Christmas, okay? Where there's a specific Christmas day, but maybe you might use the word Christmas to refer to the whole general time period. That's very common in language. It shouldn't surprise you. It's kind of like how when you say summer is a season, but also there's an official day when summer begins. These are rough equivalents. So, for example, in Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 21, the Bible says, in the first month, in the 14th day of the month, ye shall have the Passover, comma, a feast of 7 days, semicolon, unleavened bread shall be eaten. Now, in this, the phrase, a feast of 7 days, is after a comma. It's a modifying clause. And what that means is in Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 21, the Bible refers to the whole time period as Passover, not just necessarily the 14th day. In Luke chapter 22, verse 1, it says the feast of unleavened drew nigh, which is called the Passover. Now, the feast of unleavened bread was the whole period. It wasn't just the one day. That whole period of unleavened bread was referred to as Passover, even in the Bible, in Luke chapter 22, verse 1. Now, you have to remember that the same person who wrote Luke chapter 22, verse 1, wrote Acts, which was Luke. And so it's important to remember that because Luke in Luke 22, verse 1, referred to the whole Feast of Unleavened Bread, which would have included the days of unleavened bread in the 14th day of Nisan. He refers to that as Pascha. Okay? There are a lot of scholars that disagree that Pascha only refers to the 14th day of the month. Vincent's Word Study says Pascha refers to, quote, the whole 7 days of the feast. Thayer in his lexicon says the Paschal feast, the feast of Passover, extended from the 14th to the 20th day of the month of Nisan. Zodiates, who was an actual native Greek speaker, in his lexicon and the New Testament Word Study says Passover, quote, in a wider sense, also included the 7 days of unleavened bread. Strong in his concordance said it could that the word Pascha could refer to the Passover festival. Okay, so the Bible and even biblical languages scholars don't necessarily agree with the presupposition that the word Pascha or Passover is only referring to the 14th day of Nisan. And both the Bible itself and lexicons agree that the word Pascha can refer to the whole 7 day period. Well, it'd be 8 days, I'm sorry. Okay? So it's not necessarily good hermeneutics and sound consistent reasoning to say Pascha in Acts chapter 12, verse 4 is a pagan holiday simply because Passover, according to the Mosaic law, was only the 14th day of Nisan, because you can see again in the Bible that the word Passover or Pascha could be referring to the whole festival period. Okay? Now, the other issue with this is people say, well, Herod was observing a pagan holiday and he was waiting, and people say this. And so, for example, in his commentary on Acts, Patton Gloag asserted that Herod of Acts 12 was, quote, in strict observance of the Mosaic law. According to strict Jews, it was not lawful to defile their festal days with executions. And Herod prided himself on being a strict observer of the law. Josephus, for example, Josephus was a Jewish writer during that time period, during the time shortly after Christ. He said, quote, that Herod forbore to execute that Herod was strongly attached to Jewish law. Livermore maintained that Herod forbore to execute Peter during the feast of Passover out of regard to the custom of the Jews. And if you look, we don't have it here, but in one of the verses before or after, it says that Herod was wanting to he was intending after Easter here, and it says before that he was wanting to please the Jews. He was wanting to please the Jews. So this idea that Herod is trying to observe some pagan holiday because he's a pagan, well, there's not really historical evidence for that. In fact, Josephus said Herod was zealous for the law, and I think when you read that, I think even Paul was before one of the Herods. I think it was this Herod. I might not be exactly correct, but I know one of the Herods, Paul was talking about how he was zealous for the law or something to that nature. So this idea is weak. So the idea that Easter in the King James is referring to a pagan holiday, It's based on some erroneous and fallacious thinking. It's based on etymology being the final determiner of meaning. It's based on the fact that Passover always referred to the 14th day of the month. And it's dependent on this idea that Herod was observing a pagan holiday. Without those three presuppositions being true, Easter in Acts chapter 12 being a pagan holiday is very scant. I would say it's zeal with knowledge. And well, I think what's happening here, and we're gonna get, and this will segue perfectly, is people who are King James only, people who defend the King James, in their effort, in their zeal to defend the King James Bible, I think that they're missing what the text really says, and they're kind of missing what's there. But I would equally say that people who are not King James only, who are trying to attack the King James, are equally wrong, and they're not seeing what's really there. So from my extensive study, and I know I have a minority position on this among people who, esteem the King James Version, and preach for people who, I also preach from the King James Version. I don't believe that Easter is a pagan holiday, but I also don't believe that it's an error. Now, there is a third position, and the third position is that the word Easter here is referring to a Christian celebration of the resurrection. I'll deal with that maybe later in this video, but let me just say what I think the true meaning of Easter is. We've already discussed that words are not merely defined by their etymological roots. Their roots, whether that's the historical root or the phonetic, the sound of the words, words are defined by how, not the only way, but they're mainly determined by how people use the words. Okay? We need to realize that the way we use the word Easter today in our culture is not necessarily how the word Easter was used in 1611 when the King James translators translated the Bible. Take a word like conversation. The Bible talks about our conversation. Peter talks about there's a verse in the Bible, remember, where it is we need to be holy in all manner of conversation. If we took the word conversation and we defined it etymologically, you would see it comes from the word converse, which means to speak. We talk about conversation. That's an etymological root, but the thing is that word has changed meaning. And conversation today means a talking, but in the Bible times, the word conversation didn't mean that. It meant the whole of your behavior, all of your character. The Greek definition of the word is very clear. Webster's 1828 dictionary even says conversation can mean the general course of manners and behaviors. That's how the word's used in 1828 and in 1611. So just like the word conversation can change meaning, so the word Easter. And so we have to understand and define Easter not by ancient etymological roots, not necessarily by how we use it today, but how do they actually use it. Now, something that is interesting is that the Anglo-Saxon translation of the Greek word here that you see right here on the screen, you see Pascha, is very interesting. This word Pascha, every time in the Anglo-Saxon, which Anglo-Saxon was like a precursor to English, Anglo-Saxon always translates this word Pascha with an equivalent with the word Iostro. Iostro. Matthew 26 verse 2. And the King James says, in 2 days is the feast of the Passover. In the Anglo-Saxon, it says Eastro. Matthew 16:19 says in the King James, they made ready the Passover. The Anglo-Saxon translation uses the word Easter. Same thing in Mark 14 verse 12. Now, in Old English Bibles like older English Bibles like Tyndale and Coverdale and Beck and Cardmartin, they followed the old Anglo-Saxon mode or method of using the word Easter. So in older English, uses the word Easter as a translation of the word Passover. Now that doesn't prove necessarily that Easter in Acts chapter 12 verse 4 means Passover, but it is interesting. Now it's really interesting. The Old English Bibles like William Tyndale is commonly credited with coming up with the word Passover. Okay? Before that, people, they translated Pascha as Easter. That was the word they used. In the Encyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature, it says all earlier English versions use Easter, which had frequently been used as a translation of Pascha. You could also see this in the Eastern Bible Dictionary. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 and 8, when Tyndale said that Christ was our it says he was our Easter lamb is offered up for us. And the King James says Passover lamb. In Hebrews 11, verse 28, Tyndale said, through faith, he ordained the Easter lamb. Tyndale uses the word Easter as a synonym for Passover. Doesn't use it as reference as a pagan holiday. Miles Coverdale in Numbers chapter 9, verse 2 in the Coverdale Bible, another early English Bible, says, quote, let the children of Israel keep Easter in his season. Leviticus 23, verse 5 says, upon ye 14th day of the first month at evening is the Lord's Easter. Ezekiel 45:21 says, upon the 14th day of the first month ye shall keep Easter. 7 days shall the feast continue. Notice again how Coverdale used the word Easter as a synonym for Passover. The Bishop's Bible did the same thing. We won't read it for sake of time. The Geneva Bible marginal notes in Deuteronomy 16 verse 2, where the Geneva in the text says, thou shalt therefore offer the Passover. In the margin it says, thou shalt eat the Easter lamb. It has similar notes like that in Exodus 23 verse 15, Matthew 27 verse 15. So I have a question that I have to ask and that I want people to answer. Are we to conclude that Tyndale, Coverdale, the Geneva Bible, and the Bishop's Bible, are we to conclude that did they not understand that Easter was obviously a pagan holiday? Or is it possible that, were they so incompetent, all of them in the English, that they thought the Hebrew Passover was the same thing as a pagan festival? Or that, did they really think that, this is an Old Testament where they're using the word Easter? Don't they know Easter is a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus? Do we really think that they're incompetent? Or is it possible that the way they used the word Easter in English during that time period is different than the way that we use it today? And remember that Tyndale and Coverdale and the Geneva and the Bishops are a lot closer in time chronologically to the King James than we are in 2020. Okay? I think we need to stop forcing our etymological and root fallacy definitions of Easter onto the word Easter in Acts 12 verse 4, and we need to recognize that the way that it's used now, it's the same thing. Like, not only in earlier English Bible commentaries, John Gill wrote his commentary around the 1700s. He said in Judges 2 verse 13, quote, hence to this day we call the Passover Easter. Gill, writing in the early 1700s, said in their day they called the Passover Easter. The Cambridge Bible Commentary does the same thing, refers to the unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as Easter. They say, quote, the rendering Easter is an attempt to give an English word the notion of the whole feast. And the Cambridge Bible was published in the late 1800s and the very early 1900s. So why did the King James translate the word Easter here instead of Passover? A lot of King James Bible believers will ask this question, and it's a fair question. They'll say, and I've talked to them and I've read articles, surely there must be a reason why they have Easter in Acts 12 verse 4 and not in other places. Well, I don't believe it's because they made an error. And I don't believe it's because they were trying to denote a pagan holiday. I don't believe it's referring to a Christian celebration of the resurrection either. Why did they use the word Easter? Many people assume from the difference that there has to be some real solid, substantial theological difference. But I think we can find from the King James translators themselves. You can go and read it. But essentially in the preface, they talk about how they were criticized for not maintaining what was, quote, a uniformity of phrasing or to an identity of words. They say, quote, truly that we might not vary from the sense which we had translated before if the words signified the same thing. And then they went on to defend their use of using, quote, diverse words. And they talk about how God used diverse words in his holy writ and indifferently for one thing in nature. So they're saying we use the same words that are different. We use different words to mean the same thing. And they talk about how they did that. They said that we had the liberty to do that. God himself does that. So if you go and you read, what they're saying is they did not use an, I quote, identity of phrasing, and that they decided to, quote, vary from the sense of that which we had translated before, and they admitted that they used synonyms for words, which were what they called diverse words, but, quote, indifferently for one thing in nature, meaning they used different words to say the same thing. I believe what happened in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, is that it's one of the places where, for whatever reason, they left it out. Because if you look in the English Bibles, from the time of Tyndale to today, the word Easter to mean Passover slowly began to fade out as Passover became more common. And I think for whatever reason, they left it in. I don't know if it's for variety, for style. I mean, it could be something as simple as, there could be a multitude of reasons why. I don't believe it's because it was a pagan holiday, and I don't believe it was a Christian celebration of Easter. Now, the resurrection. Now, there's a guy named Nick Sayers, and you may have seen articles. There's a growing movement where people they're rightly identifying that, and these are King James only people who are rightly identifying that it's not a pagan holiday, and they're trying to say that, well, the word Easter here is it's because it's a post-resurrection appearance of the word Pascha. And I've heard some people even say that this is referring to, there was a Christian celebration of the resurrection there, and Herod was trying to keep Christians from, rioting or something and whatever. But the thing is, it was unlawful for the Jews, it was seen as uncouth and wrong to put somebody to death during their holy festival, which would have been this whole time period. Herod he said he had respect. Herod seemed to be respectful of the Torah, and the Bible explicitly says here in Acts 12 verse 4, Herod was intending after Easter. He's intending after what I believe is. I'm not saying the King James is wrong here. I'm saying that I believe the King James translators were using the word Easter to refer to Passover. And I think if you look at the context, if you look at this Greek word everywhere else in the Bible, it refers to the Jewish Passover festival. So if it's referring to some Christian New Testament celebration of the resurrection, we're never told in the Bible that this word Pascha came to be known as a Christian celebration of the resurrection. And, people will go to modern Greek dictionaries and they'll show that this word Pascha today means Easter and means the New Testament celebration of Jesus. But again, that's 2020 Greek, okay? We're talking about this word Pascha, and it's written by Luke in that time period, and I personally believe that it's not an error in the King James to have Easter. It's not a pagan holiday. It's not a Christian celebration of Easter. It was just an older way for them. It was a carryover, I think, from Anglo-Saxon to define Easter. Because if you're going to say that Easter is referring to either a pagan holiday or it's referring to a New Testament celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you're going to have to explain to me, why did Tyndale, Coverdale, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible, John Gill, and many other people from English during that time period, why did many of them explicitly use the English word Easter in context where they are absolutely referring to the Jewish Passover festival? How do we know that the King James translators were not using the word Easter here, just like Coverdale, Tyndale, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible, and many other English writers and commentators and preachers from that time period? So this is why I believe that it's not an error, But I believe that Easter in the King James Bible, in the English language of that time, I believe that they were intending to communicate Passover, and they just chose to use a synonym. That's my theory on Easter.